Earth didn't fall in war. It was erased. No warnings. No resistance. No survivors. At least, that's what they believed. Because when the sky burned and the oceans vanished, humanity didn't fight back. It disappeared. And for decades, the galaxy moved on, certain of one thing: they had eliminated a species before it could become a threat. They were wrong, because humanity didn't die with Earth. It changed, and what came back wasn't trying to survive. It was looking for a reason to exist. Earth didn't fall in chaos. It fell in silence. There were no final warnings, no last transmissions, no desperate calls echoing through space. Just light, blinding, unnatural light stretching across the sky. And then, nothing. Oceans didn't boil slowly. They vanished. Continents didn't fracture over time. They split. Atmosphere collapsed into storms that never had time to form. Everything that defined a living world was erased in moments. From orbit, it looked clean, precise, final. For the civilizations responsible, it wasn't destruction. It was correction. A necessary action taken against a species that had been carefully observed and carefully judged. Humanity had been studied for years, its wars recorded, its divisions analyzed, its contradictions measured. The conclusion had been consistent. Potential undeniable, but unstable. Too emotional, too divided, too unpredictable to be allowed to mature unchecked. Left alone, humanity might have become something dangerous. So they didn't wait. They acted. And in a single coordinated event, they removed the problem. No prolonged war. No resistance. No retaliation. Because there was nothing left to retaliate. The Earth was gone. And with it, humanity. That was the assumption. That was the conclusion entered into their systems. That was the moment the war ended, before it had even begun. For a time, the galaxy accepted it. Records updated. Threat assessments cleared. Humanity was archived as a species that had nearly become something significant, but never did. A possibility erased before realization. A variable removed from the equation. And for decades, nothing challenged that belief. No signals. No movement. No sign of survival. The silence of Earth became the silence of humanity. Total, absolute, convincing. But silence isn't always absence. Sometimes, it's what remains after something changes. Because Earth had been destroyed. That much was true. But humanity had not died with it. Not completely. Fragments survived. Not by design. Not by strategy. By accident. Colonies too distant to be reached in time. Stations operating outside standard networks. Ships lost in transit when the attack occurred. Scattered pieces. Too small to matter. Too isolated to rebuild. Too insignificant to be considered a threat. And that was the second mistake. Because those fragments didn't try to rebuild Earth. They didn't try to reconnect. They didn't try to restore what had been lost. Because they couldn't. There was no center left to return to. No home to anchor them. No future to aim for. Only absence. And inside that absence, something began to change. At first, it was subtle. Behavioral. Psychological. Human groups that once depended on structure began to operate differently. Decision-making shifted. Priorities collapsed. Survival replaced everything else. Not survival to live. Survival to continue. There was a difference. And over time, that difference grew. Without a planet. Without a unified identity. Without the idea of a future beyond the next moment. Humanity lost something fundamental. But in losing it, it gained something else. Something far more dangerous. Because when a species no longer fights for progress, no longer fights for stability, no longer fights for a future it believes in, it begins to fight for something else entirely. Something simpler. Something harder to stop. It fights to not disappear. Decades passed. The galaxy moved on. Empires expanded. Conflicts shifted. New threats emerged. And humanity remained forgotten. Or so they believed. Because far beyond the systems that had once mapped Earth, far beyond the reach of the civilizations that had erased it, those fragments were still there. Still adapting. Still changing. Not rebuilding what they had lost, but becoming something new. Not a civilization. Not a species defined by culture or history, but something shaped by pressure, by loss, by absence. Something that no longer needed a home to exist. And that was the part no one had studied. No one had modeled. No one had prepared for. Because they had studied humanity as it was, when it had something to lose. They had never studied what remained, when it didn't. And by the time the first signs of that change reached the edges of known space, it was already too late, because what had survived Earth was no longer trying to live the way it once had. It was preparing for something else. Not recovery, not reconstruction, something colder, something quieter, something inevitable. Because when you take everything from a species, you don't always destroy it. Sometimes, you remove everything that was holding it back. At first, survival wasn't strategic. It wasn't coordinated. It wasn't even intentional. It was instinct. Fragments of humanity, scattered across empty systems, did what every living thing does when faced with extinction. They endured. Colonies that had once depended on steady supply chains found themselves alone, cut off from everything they had been built to rely on. Stations designed for temporary operation became permanent habitats. Ships meant for travel became homes. Every system began to fail. Not suddenly, but inevitably. Resources dwindled. Equipment degraded. Infrastructure, once maintained by networks spanning entire planets, now depended on whoever remained alive to keep it running. And most of it wasn't designed to last. At first, they tried to preserve what they had. Follow protocols. Maintain structure. Operate within the limits of their original design. But those limits didn't account for extinction. And so one by one, those limits were abandoned. Systems were modified beyond recognition. Machines repurposed for functions they were never built to perform. Life support integrated with propulsion systems. Weapons converted into tools. Tools converted into weapons. Nothing remained fixed. Nothing remained sacred, because survival didn't allow for permanence. It demanded change. And change came fast. Faster than any controlled evolution. Faster than any system could predict. Because there was no time for refinement. Only adaptation. Human bodies began to reflect it. Environments once considered uninhabitable became the only options left. Low gravity, high radiation, extreme temperature variance. Conditions that would have once required specialized equipment now became constant exposure. At first, survival depended on technology. Suit integrity, shielding, artificial regulation. But over time, that wasn't enough, because technology fails. And when it does, something else has to compensate. Generation by generation, small changes accumulated. Subtle at first, barely measurable, but persistent. Tolerance increased. Recovery accelerated. Thresholds shifted, not by design, not through controlled enhancement, but through necessity. Those who couldn't adapt didn't survive. Those who did passed it on. And slowly, the baseline changed. Not enough to be called something new, but enough to no longer be what it once was. The same happened to the mind. Without a centralized society, without shared culture, without continuity of tradition, human identity fractured. Old concepts lost relevance. Nations meant nothing. Borders meant nothing. Even the idea of home began to dissolve. What remained was simpler, more immediate, more focused. Survive, adapt, continue. Everything else became secondary. Memory didn't disappear, but it changed. Earth was remembered, but not as something to return to, not as something to rebuild, as something that had been taken, something final, something that defined the past, but no longer shaped the future. And without a future tied to a place, humanity began to redefine itself, not around where it came from, but around what it had become. Across distant regions, isolated human groups evolved differently. Different environments, different pressures, different solutions. No two were the same, and yet, they shared something fundamental. A shift in purpose. They no longer sought stability. They no longer sought growth in the traditional sense. They no longer measured success by expansion, prosperity, or control. They measured it by continuation, by the simple fact that they were still there, still alive, still changing, still refusing to disappear. Over time, that refusal hardened. What began as instinct became identity, not a unified one, not a shared culture, but a shared condition. Existence without guarantee, survival without safety, adaptation without limits. And from that condition, something new emerged. Not cooperation, not unity, recognition. Across vast distances, without communication, without coordination, human groups began to understand something about themselves. Not consciously, not through shared knowledge, but through experience. They were no longer what had been studied, no longer what had been modeled, no longer what had been erased. They were something else, something that didn't fit within previous definitions, something that didn't behave within expected boundaries, something that didn't rely on the structures that had once defined them, and that made them invisible, not physically, but strategically, because the civilizations that had destroyed Earth had studied humanity as a system, a structured, predictable, analyzable system. And systems can be broken, can be controlled, can be eliminated, but what remained of humanity was no longer a system. It was something else, something fragmented, something adaptive, something that didn't need to be whole to function, and that made it impossible to remove in the same way. The fragments didn't try to reconnect, didn't try to rebuild a unified civilization, because they didn't need to. Each fragment survived on its own, changed on its own, evolved on its own, and yet, all of them were moving in the same direction, not toward a shared goal, but toward a shared state, one where survival was no longer enough, one where existence demanded something more, not stability, not safety, something else, something that hadn't fully formed yet, but was already shaping everything they were becoming. Because when survival stops being the objective, something replaces it, and whatever comes next is never predictable. For years, survival had been enough. It had to be. There was nothing else. No future to build toward. No past that could be restored. No system left to belong to. Only the next moment, the next repair, the next adaptation, the next breath. And for a time, that was everything. But survival by itself doesn't last. Not as a purpose. Not as a reason to keep going. Because surviving without direction eventually becomes something else. Drift. And humanity didn't drift. Not for long. Across isolated systems, something began to shift. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Human groups that had spent years focused solely on endurance began to change the way they acted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently. Decisions stopped being purely reactive, stopped being about immediate survival. They began to carry weight, intent. In one sector, a group of survivors diverted precious resources away from life support optimization to reinforce long-range propulsion systems, a decision that reduced their margin for survival, but increased their range. In another, a station modified its defensive capabilities not to protect itself, but to project force beyond its immediate perimeter. Elsewhere, isolated vessels began altering navigation patterns, no longer remaining hidden or stationary, but moving, deliberately, toward something, not coordinated, not communicated, but similar. Across vast distances, without contact, without shared strategy, humanity began to lean in the same direction, away from hiding, away from containment, away from simply enduring, and toward something else, something undefined, but consistent, movement. At first, it wasn't noticed, not by anyone outside those scattered remnants, because individually, they were still insignificant, still fragmented, still too small to matter. But collectively, they were changing, and change creates signals, faint, distant, but detectable. Long-range sensors in neutral systems began to pick up irregular human activity, unidentified vessels crossing zones long considered inactive, energy signatures appearing where none should exist, short bursts of transmission, fragmented, incomplete, but unmistakably human in origin. Nothing organized, nothing coordinated, nothing that suggested a unified return, but enough to raise questions. Still, no one acted, because nothing about it suggested a threat. Not yet, because what was emerging didn't look like a civilization rebuilding. It didn't look like an empire reforming. It didn't look like anything familiar. It looked aimless, unstructured, unpredictable, and that made it easy to ignore, at first. But within the remnants of humanity, it didn't feel aimless. It felt inevitable, because something had changed at a deeper level. Survival had kept them alive. Adaptation had reshaped them. But neither answered a question that had been growing, quietly, in the absence of everything they once knew. Why? Why continue? Why endure? Why fight, when there was nothing left to return to? And that question didn't break them. It refined them. Right when it became clear this wasn't survival anymore, that humanity wasn't trying to rebuild, but becoming something else. If you're into stories where humans refuse to disappear, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who still thinks humanity is fragile. Because from this point on, this isn't about survival. It's about what happens when a species has nothing left to lose. Because when a species loses everything, it has two options. It disappears, or it redefines itself. Humanity chose the second, not consciously, not through agreement, but through action. Across the void, one behavior became more frequent, more intentional, more dangerous. Human groups began seeking contact, not peaceful contact, not diplomatic contact, but proximity, observation, engagement. They moved toward known trade routes, toward contested systems, toward regions occupied by other species, not to integrate, not to communicate, but to see, to measure, to understand. And what they found was the galaxy that had moved on without them. Empires expanding, civilizations thriving, systems functioning as if nothing had ever been lost, as if Earth had never existed, as if humanity had never mattered. And that was the moment everything changed, because memory didn't fade. It sharpened. The destruction of Earth was no longer just a fact. It became context, not something to mourn, something to define, not something to recover, something to answer. Across isolated human groups, a realization took form. Not spoken, not shared, but mirrored. They had lost their home, their origin, their place in the galaxy. But the galaxy had not lost anything. It had continued, unaffected, unchanged. And that imbalance demanded correction, not out of anger, not out of rage, something colder, something clearer. If existence had no inherent meaning left, then meaning would have to be created. And the only thing left that connected all fragments of humanity was what had been taken from them. Not culture, not identity, not history. Loss. Total, irreversible. And from that loss, a direction emerged. Not survival, not rebuilding. Something else. Something sharper. Something final. Purpose. Not given, not inherited. Chosen. And once chosen, it didn't need to be spoken. Because every fragment of humanity, across every isolated system, began moving toward the same conclusion. Different paths, different methods, different forms, but the same end. They were no longer asking how to survive. They were asking what to become. And slowly, the answer began to take shape, not as a civilization, not as a species trying to reclaim its place, but as something new, something defined not by what it had been, but by what had been done to it, and what it intended to do in return. Because for the first time since Earth had fallen, humanity wasn't just continuing, it was deciding. And that decision would change everything. The first confirmed sighting didn't trigger panic. It triggered confusion. A trade vessel operating along a mid-tier commercial route detected an unidentified ship entering its sensor range. The signature was irregular, inconsistent energy output, unstable propulsion rhythm. No recognizable identification markers. At first, it was flagged as debris, then as a malfunctioning craft, then something else, because it was moving with intent, not drifting, not decaying, approaching. Attempts to establish standard communication protocols yielded nothing. No response, no signal acknowledgement, no negotiation behavior, only continued approach, slow, deliberate, uninterrupted. When the vessel entered visual range, the anomaly deepened. Its structure didn't match any known design. Not alien, not standard human, something in between. Segments of different origins fused together. Hull plating mismatched. Systems exposed in ways that suggested modification rather than design. It wasn't built. It was assembled. And not with efficiency in mind, but with necessity. The trade vessel initiated defensive protocols. Minimal, cautious. There was no immediate indication of threat, no weapons lock, no aggressive maneuvering, just proximity. And then, contact, not through communication, through action. The unidentified vessel didn't fire, didn't engage in conventional combat. It attached, physically, locking onto the hull with mechanical precision. Not invasive, not destructive, controlled, purposeful. Within seconds, the outer systems of the trade vessel began to fail. Not from overload, not from attack, but from interference. Selective, targeted, as if something inside the unknown craft understood exactly how those systems worked, and how to disable them without destroying them. The process was clean, efficient, silent. Life support remained intact, structural integrity preserved, crew unharmed. Only one thing was taken: data, navigation logs, trade routes, system maps, movement patterns. Then, just as suddenly as it had attached, the vessel detached. No escalation, no pursuit, no further action. It left, disappearing back into deep space. The incident was recorded, analyzed, filed, initially classified as an isolated anomaly, until it happened again and again. Across different regions, along different routes, similar encounters began to surface. Unidentified vessels, irregular signatures, non-standard construction, no communication, no aggression, at least not in the way it was understood. They didn't destroy, they didn't conquer. They observed, interacted, extracted, and left. Each encounter precise, each interaction controlled, each target selected carefully. Not random, not opportunistic, deliberate. Patterns began to form. Trade networks, transit corridors, logistical hubs. Every system critical to movement and coordination became a point of interest. Still, the response remained measured, because nothing was being lost. No ships destroyed, no lives taken, no territories invaded. Only information, and information alone, didn't justify escalation, at least not immediately. But analysts began to notice something else, something more subtle. The vessels weren't just gathering data. They were learning. Every subsequent encounter became more efficient, more refined, less time required, fewer system disruptions, cleaner extraction, as if each interaction was improving the next, as if whoever was behind them was adapting in real time. And then came the first confirmed identification, not through direct contact, but through pattern recognition. Fragments of code recovered from multiple encounters, structural similarities in ship construction, energy signatures that, when isolated and analyzed, matched something archived, something old, something that shouldn't have existed anymore. Human, not fully, not in any conventional sense, but unmistakably derived from it. The conclusion was resisted at first, dismissed, re-evaluated, tested again and again, until it couldn't be denied. Humanity, or something that had once been humanity, had returned, but not as expected. Not as survivors seeking reintegration, not as refugees looking for stability, not as a species trying to rebuild. Something else, something quieter, something far more focused, because they weren't announcing themselves. They weren't reclaiming territory. They weren't even defending anything. They were preparing, and preparation implied intent. That's when concern began to grow. Not fear, not yet, but awareness. Because the behavior didn't match any known pattern of post-extinction recovery. It didn't match desperation. It didn't match expansion. It didn't match survival. It matched something else entirely. Something deliberate. Something patient. Something that required time and understanding. The galaxy had moved on after Earth. Adjust, expanded, forgotten. But now, something that had been erased was moving again. Quietly, carefully, without asking for permission. Without announcing its presence, without making demands. And that made it more dangerous than any known threat, because threats could be identified, measured, prepared for. This couldn't, not yet, but that would change, because eventually, observation becomes action. And whatever humanity had become, it was getting closer to that moment, with every system it mapped, with every pattern it learned, with every encounter it refined. It was building something, not a fleet, not an empire, something else, something that didn't need to be seen to exist, something that didn't need to be understood to function, something that only needed one thing, to begin. And when it did, the galaxy wouldn't be confused anymore. It would understand, too late, but clearly, that humanity hadn't returned to reclaim what it lost. It had returned for something else entirely. For a long time, the pattern held. Observation, interference, extraction, withdrawal. No escalation, no destruction, no visible intent beyond understanding. That's what made it difficult to classify, difficult to justify a response, because nothing had been taken, except information. And information by itself wasn't war, until it became something else. The first disruption didn't look like an attack. It looked like failure. A major transit corridor, one of the most stable logistical routes connecting multiple systems, collapsed without warning. Navigation grids desynchronized, jump coordinates misaligned. Ships entering the corridor began to emerge in incorrect locations. Some off course, some dangerously close to gravitational hazards. Some, not at all. At first, it was treated as a technical malfunction, a rare but possible breakdown in synchronization protocols. Systems were reset, coordinates recalibrated, traffic rerouted temporarily. But the issue didn't resolve. It spread. Adjacent routes began to show similar irregularities. Not identical, but connected. Subtle deviations in timing. Minor inconsistencies in spatial alignment. Individually manageable. Collectively, destabilizing. Trade slowed. Transit efficiency dropped. Delays accumulated. Still, no direct cause. No identifiable attacker. No clear source of interference. Until the analysis deepened. Data from previous, non-hostile encounters was re-examined. Patterns aligned. The same systems that had been accessed. The same routes that had been mapped. The same nodes that had been observed. Were now the ones failing. Not randomly. Not chaotically. Precisely. The conclusion formed quickly. What had been taken was being used. Not for destruction. For control. The second incident removed all doubt. A mid-level defense platform stationed at the edge of a contested region went offline. Not destroyed. Not attacked. Deactivated. Internal systems shut down in sequence. Command pathways overridden. Fail-safes bypassed. Everything executed with familiarity. As if the system had been designed by whoever was disabling it. Backup systems activated. Then followed the same pattern. Step by step. Layer by layer. Until nothing remained operational. Moments later, long-range sensors detected movement. Multiple unidentified vessels entering the now unprotected region. They didn't attack. They didn't occupy. They passed through. Unchallenged. The platform remained intact. Useless. The message wasn't subtle. Access had become influence. Influence had become control. And control had become capability. Across multiple systems, similar events began to occur. Infrastructure failed without visible cause. Defense networks lost synchronization. Supply chains broke at critical points. Not through force, but through precision. Every failure occurred where it mattered most. Every disruption targeted systems that supported larger structures. Nothing wasted. Nothing random. It wasn't widespread destruction. It was selective removal of stability. And without stability, everything else begins to fail. The response escalated. Monitoring increased. Security protocols reinforced. Systems isolated. Manual overrides prioritized. But the more they tried to protect, the more limitations they exposed. Because protection requires structure, requires predictability, requires systems that behave consistently. And those systems had already been studied, already been understood, already been mapped. The realization spread, slowly, reluctantly. What had been dismissed as passive observation had been preparation. And what was happening now was execution. But still, no war was declared, no formal conflict initiated, no demands issued, no claims made, because this wasn't a war in the way the galaxy understood it. It didn't begin with confrontation. It began with removal, removing control, removing certainty, removing the ability to respond effectively. And that made it more dangerous than any direct attack, because by the time a system realizes it's under threat, it's already compromised. The first real loss came quietly. A regional coordination hub, responsible for synchronizing multiple fleets across adjacent systems, failed. Not partially, completely. Communication between units collapsed. Timing desynchronized. Command chains broke. Units operated blindly. And within that confusion, movement appeared. Human. Unmistakable. They didn't engage in battle. They didn't attempt to destroy the fleets. They didn't need to. Because without coordination, those fleets weren't threats anymore. They were isolated, fragmented, predictable. One by one, they were bypassed, ignored, neutralized without contact. The scale of what was happening finally became clear. This wasn't disruption. It wasn't interference. It wasn't even strategy in the traditional sense. It was something else. Something built over time. Something that didn't rely on strength, but on understanding. Humanity wasn't attacking the galaxy. It was dismantling it, piece by piece, from the inside. And the most dangerous part was that it had already begun long before anyone realized it. Because the war didn't start when the first system failed. It started the moment humanity decided to come back. And now, it was too late to stop it from unfolding. Because everything that was happening now had already been set in motion. Quietly, patiently, inevitably. For a time, they tried to contain it. To classify the phenomenon as a localized threat. A fragmented remnant of a species that had survived beyond expectation, but could still be managed, still be controlled, still be eliminated. That assumption didn't last. Because containment requires boundaries. And what humanity had become didn't operate within them. Every attempt to isolate the activity failed. Every effort to predict movement produced incomplete results. Every response arrived too late or too early. The problem wasn't scale. It was nature. This wasn't a centralized force. It wasn't a coordinated fleet. It wasn't a system that could be disrupted by targeting a core. It was distributed, adaptive, everywhere, and nowhere at the same time. And that made one thing clear. There would be no gradual solution, no containment, no slow correction. Only one option remained: final elimination. The decision was made at the highest levels of the civilizations responsible for Earth's destruction. Not out of fear, not out of desperation, but out of logic. The same logic that had led them to destroy Earth in the first place. Identify the threat, remove it completely. This time, without leaving fragments behind. The operation would be different, more precise, more comprehensive. No reliance on centralized targets, no assumption of structure. Instead, total coverage. Every known human signal, every detected movement, every region where activity had been recorded. All of it, marked, mapped, scheduled for eradication. Simultaneously. No delay, no hesitation. Because delay had already proven costly. The operation began without announcement, without warning. Across the galaxy, in regions where human presence had been detected, space lit up again. Not as it had over Earth. Not in a single moment, but in many. Coordinated strikes across multiple systems. Precision deployments targeting every known fragment of humanity. Stations eliminated. Ships intercepted. Colonies erased. This time, there would be no survivors. That was the intent. That was the expectation. And at first, it worked. Signals disappeared. Regions went silent. Human activity dropped sharply. For a brief moment, the models stabilized again. The projections returned to certainty. The same certainty that had existed when Earth fell. The same conclusion. The same assumption. Humanity would be gone. Completely. Finally. But something didn't align. Because the silence this time was different. It didn't feel like absence. It felt temporary. Across monitored regions, the expected follow-through didn't occur. No cascading collapse of remaining activity. No complete disappearance of signals. Instead, something else began. Faint at first. Almost imperceptible. Then growing. Human responses didn't fragment. They didn't scatter. They converged. Not physically. Not into fleets or formations. But in purpose. For the first time since Earth had fallen, humanity stopped acting as isolated fragments. Stopped behaving as independent survivors. Stopped moving in parallel directions. And began moving as one. Not through communication. Not through command. But through alignment. Every remaining human presence, no matter how distant, no matter how different, turned toward the same target, the same source, the same origin of everything that had been taken, the civilizations that had destroyed Earth. That was the moment the war truly began. Not when the first systems failed, not when infrastructure collapsed, but when humanity found a single, shared direction. Because until then, they had been surviving, adapting, becoming. Now, they had a reason, not survival. Not expansion, not even restoration. Something else. Something colder. Something final. They had been given a purpose. Not by themselves, but by the very act meant to erase them. Because in trying to end humanity completely, the invaders had done what decades of isolation never could. They had unified it. Not as a civilization, not as a culture, but as a force. A singular intent shared across every fragment that remained. Not driven by emotion. Not driven by rage, but by clarity. Everything they were, everything they had become, now pointed in one direction, and that direction led back to those who had taken everything from them. The invaders believed they were ending a threat. What they had actually done was create one, because a fragmented species can be studied, adapted to, managed, but a species with a single purpose cannot be stopped the same way. And for the first time since the destruction of Earth, humanity wasn't just changing. It wasn't just surviving. It wasn't just learning. It was focusing. And once that focus locked into place, there was no reversing it, no dispersing it, no containing it. Because now, there was only one outcome left to reach. And every part of humanity was moving toward it, together, inevitably, silently. The final war hadn't been declared. It hadn't been announced. But it had begun. And this time, there would be no misunderstanding what it was. Not survival, not resistance, not adaptation. This was the answer. When the war fully revealed itself, it didn't look like war. Not in any form the galaxy recognized. There were no front lines, no territorial disputes, no strategic objectives in the traditional sense, no attempt to conquer, no attempt to negotiate, no attempt to control, because control was never the goal. The first major engagements confused every system designed to interpret conflict. Human forces didn't advance in formations. They didn't hold ground. They didn't secure positions after engagement. They appeared, struck, and vanished, not randomly, not chaotically, but without any visible end state. In one system, a critical shipyard responsible for constructing deep space fleets was disabled in a matter of minutes. Not destroyed, its production chains corrupted, its internal systems reconfigured to the point where restoration would take years. Then the human presence disappeared. No occupation, no follow-up strike, just absence. In another region, an entire fleet was redirected, not through direct combat, through manipulation. Navigation systems altered, command pathways overridden, orders rewritten mid-execution. The fleet moved itself out of strategic position, leaving an entire sector exposed. Again, no direct engagement, no attempt to capitalize immediately, just disruption. Elsewhere, planetary defense grids failed simultaneously across multiple systems. Not from overload, not from assault, from precision interference. Every weakness identified, every dependency exploited, every safeguard bypassed. And once the systems collapsed, human forces withdrew. The pattern repeated, across hundreds of engagements. Disable, disrupt, destabilize, leave. No consolidation, no expansion, no visible attempt to win. At first, it was interpreted as inefficiency, a lack of coordination, an inability to capitalize on success. But that interpretation didn't last, because over time, the consequences became clear. Every disrupted system remained unstable. Every disabled structure required disproportionate resources to restore. Every manipulated fleet took time to reorganize. Every interference event created ripple effects across multiple sectors. Individually, none of it was decisive. Collectively, it was devastating, because the war wasn't being fought to achieve victory conditions. It was being fought to remove them, to erase the very concept of a stable outcome. The invaders adapted. They always had. They shifted to defensive posture, reinforced critical infrastructure, centralized command, reduced operational flexibility to regain control. But that only accelerated the problem, because rigidity is predictable, and predictability was something humanity had learned to exploit perfectly. Every defensive structure became a map, every protocol a weakness, every safeguard a point of entry. And the more the invaders tried to stabilize, the more pressure they created on themselves. Because this war wasn't about territory, it wasn't about dominance, it wasn't about power, it was about something far more difficult to counter. Persistence, relentless, unending, unstructured. Human forces didn't need to win engagements. They only needed to continue them, indefinitely. And that changed everything. Because every system in the galaxy was built around resolution, around conclusions, around outcomes that could be measured, predicted, and achieved. But this had none. There was no final objective to defend, no endpoint to reach, no threshold where victory could be declared. Only continuation, only pressure, only time. And time was no longer an advantage for the invaders. It was a liability. The longer the war continued, the more unstable their systems became. The more resources were consumed, the more uncertainty spread. Until eventually, they understood, not all at once, not through a single realization, but through accumulation, through failure, through observation. Humanity wasn't trying to defeat them. Not in the way they understood defeat. It wasn't trying to reclaim territory, or rebuild what had been lost, or even ensure its own long-term survival in a traditional sense. It was doing something else, something far more absolute. It was answering, not with destruction, not with conquest, but with transformation of the battlefield itself, turning every system into something unsustainable, turning every advantage into a burden, turning every structure into a weakness. Because the goal wasn't to win the war. The goal was to make the war unwinnable for anyone else. That was the moment the invaders understood the truth. This wasn't revenge in the way they had expected. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't reckless. It was precise, deliberate, inevitable, because it didn't come from anger. It came from absence, from everything that had been taken, from everything that no longer existed. Humanity hadn't come back to reclaim its place. It had come back because it no longer had won. And that made it unstoppable, because a species that fights for something can be reasoned with, can be negotiated with, can be broken. But a species that fights because it has nothing left cannot. The invaders tried to find a solution, a counter, a strategy that could end it. But every solution required stability, and stability was gone. Every system they relied on was already compromised, every model already outdated, every prediction already incomplete. There was no way to reset the war, no way to return to control, because control had never truly existed. Not once humanity had changed. The war didn't escalate into a final confrontation. It didn't build toward a decisive battle. It spread, endlessly, across systems, across structures, across every attempt to contain it. And in that spread, it consumed everything that made victory possible, until only one outcome remained. Not defeat, not destruction, something worse. Realization, because by the time they understood what they were facing, they already knew the truth. This war would never end, not because humanity couldn't be stopped, but because it no longer needed an end. In the end, there was no final battle, no last stand, no moment where one side fell and the other rose, because the war had already moved past that. It no longer needed an ending. It had become something else, something that didn't resolve, only continued. The invaders didn't collapse in a single event. They unraveled, slowly, system by system, not through overwhelming force, but through exhaustion. Their structures remained, their fleets still existed, their technology still functioned, but none of it worked the way it was meant to anymore. Every system required constant correction. Every operation demanded continuous oversight. Every action carried uncertainty. Nothing was stable. Nothing was reliable. Nothing was efficient. And efficiency had been the foundation of everything they were. Without it, they didn't know how to win. So they adapted. They tried to. They decentralized, reduced reliance on rigid structures, introduced variability into their own systems, attempted to become less predictable, more flexible, more human. But adaptation takes time. And time was something they no longer controlled, because humanity was already there, already operating inside instability, already functioning without structure, already thriving in the conditions that were breaking everything else. Every attempt the invaders made to change came too late, because humanity wasn't reacting anymore. It was defining the environment itself. And in that environment, the invaders couldn't compete, not because they were weaker, but because they were incompatible. They had been built for control, for precision, for predictable outcomes. Humanity had become something that didn't require any of those things. And that difference was irreversible. Eventually, the decision was made, not announced, not declared, but enacted. They began to withdraw, not in defeat, not in surrender, but in recognition, because continuing the war no longer served a purpose. It consumed more than it gained. It destabilized more than it secured. It threatened not just their control, but their existence. So they left, not completely, not instantly, but steadily, abandoning contested systems, relinquishing control over regions that could no longer be maintained, reducing presence, reducing engagement, trying to step away from something they could no longer contain. And humanity did not follow, did not pursue, did not chase them into retreat, because that had never been the objective. This was never about reclaiming territory, never about rebuilding Earth, never about restoring what had been lost, because none of that was possible. The Earth was gone, irreversibly, and humanity had already moved beyond needing it. What remained wasn't a civilization waiting to rise again. It wasn't a species trying to find its place. It was something else entirely, something that existed without requiring a reason, until one was given. And that reason had been the destruction of everything it once was. The invaders thought they had ended humanity when they destroyed Earth. That had been their calculation, their certainty, their mistake, because they had misunderstood something fundamental. They thought a species is defined by its home, by its structure, by its systems, by its stability, and all of that can be destroyed. But what they failed to understand is that a species is also defined by what it becomes when all of that is taken away. And what humanity became was not something they had prepared for, not something they had studied, not something they had ever encountered, because humanity didn't come back stronger, didn't come back more advanced, didn't come back unified in the way they expected. It came back unbound, no longer limited by the need for stability, no longer constrained by the idea of a future that had to be preserved, no longer tied to a place that could be taken again. And that made it something entirely different, something that didn't fit within the rules the galaxy understood, something that couldn't be measured, couldn't be predicted, couldn't be stopped in any conventional sense, because it no longer required the things that make a species vulnerable. It didn't need a home. It didn't need control. It didn't need certainty. It only needed one thing: continuation. And that was enough. In the silence that followed the withdrawal, a realization spread, not through communication, not through declaration, but through observation. Across every civilization that had watched the war unfold, the same conclusion formed. The destruction of Earth had not been a victory. It had been a transformation, because in trying to eliminate a species before it could become dangerous, they had removed everything that kept it predictable, everything that kept it contained, everything that kept it limited. And what remained was something far more difficult to face. Not a civilization, not an empire, not an enemy that could be defeated, but a condition, a presence, a force that existed across the galaxy, without needing permission to be there, and without needing a reason to continue. The Earth had been humanity's beginning, its center, its anchor, its definition, but its destruction had changed that, because what rose from its absence didn't need a beginning anymore, didn't need a center, didn't need a home. And that was the final truth the galaxy was forced to accept. They had not ended humanity. They had freed it. And in doing so, they hadn't just made a mistake. They had made something that could never be undone. Because in a galaxy built on order, structure, and control, they had created the only species that no longer depended on any of them. A species that doesn't break the same way twice. A species that doesn't stop when it should. A species that doesn't need a reason to continue, only the ability to do so. And now, it always would, because they didn't just destroy Earth. They didn't just start a war. They didn't just try to eliminate a threat. They did something far worse. They gave humanity exactly what it needed. Nothing left to lose,